In this lecture, we'll be considering the two major proponents of what are sometimes called the idealistic and the realistic schools of Confucianism. Those terms are, in a way, misnomers, but at least they indicate that there's a kind of division with regard to attitudes towards certain things in Confucius' basic ideas. The proponent of what's called the idealistic school is Mencius, or Xunzi, who lived a few generations after Confucius, in the spring and autumn period. His situation was a little different from Confucius's in that already it had become pretty obvious that going back to the previous dynasty, which had once been stable, something that Confucius thought would be really a good idea to do, was really not possible. Warfare had continued. It was so widespread by now that even the dream of stability wasn't very clear in people's minds anymore. So in a way, Confucius' message struck him as all the more important to try to promulgate. Apparently, he did visit a number of rulers, but it doesn't seem that any of them wanted to hire him, presumably that being something that he would have liked. And he spent the last decades of his life teaching. Mencius enlarged Confucius' vision, but basically attempted to transmit it. One of the things he does that's a little bit different is put more emphasis on yi over li. In the Analects, you get a certain amount of emphasis on the details of the procedures in appropriate ritual. Mencius tended to focus more on the inner person, and in general, I would say that's a kind of tendency that one can see if you want to make a comparison between Confucius that emerges from the Analects and the way Mencius articulates Confucius' ideas. In other words, if he's emphasizing yi, what he's emphasizing is the way of externalizing benevolence. If benevolence is viewed as a translation of Ren, we come very closely to Mencius' idea of what Ren is about. Confucius sometimes used the word Ren so that it seemed like the general core of being a good person, being an exemplary person. And in specific cases, he might be talking about benevolence. But on the whole, it was almost similar to exemplary. With Mencius, the focus is much more on benevolence, kindness, acting compassionately. This notion of li for Mencius was also a kind of inner sense of good manners. So again, he takes a little bit more of the emphasis away from the external practices and more on the interior person, you might say. The reason he's sometimes called idealistic is because his views about human nature were rather optimistic, especially given the time and place that he lived. Warfare is all over the place, but nevertheless, Mencius believed that human nature is basically good. Now here Mencius is continuing to challenge the Moists. I mentioned Mozi briefly last time. Mozi's view was that we need to understand human motivation in order to organize society well. And his idea was what we really ought to try to encourage is universal love, treating people essentially the same. So his programs would be much more designed to get away from ritual and get away from anything that's going to make you focus on those close to you, to a more general conception of social welfare, you might say. Oddly enough, though he was proposing universal love, which might sound rather pie in the sky, he also believed in sanctions. He was oddly a very much a law and order sort of person, and even had a kind of military unit himself. He thought these weren't really conflicting because, as Mozi saw it, most of the time people do have the desire to get what they want. And this is going to be a problem when people want the same things and can't all have them. So his idea was, if you just sort of look at human desires, what they basically are motivated by, they have some desires, they fear certain things, and these are the kind of ways to organize society. Mencius didn't agree with much that Mozi said. And one of the things he certainly disagrees with is the idea that what we ought to do is tap into human beings' desires and fears in order to figure out how to organize humanity. Mencius believed that human beings inherently had the wherewithal to develop virtue. In fact, he argues that we have motives aside from the sort of selfish motives that Mozi seemed to think were primarily important. Crucially, human beings have a faculty called Shin. Shin is translated heart and mind, where these are not considered to be two different things, but one. You might consider it a sort of feeling intelligence or emotional intelligence at the same time as thinking intelligence, all going together. These aren't divided in the Chinese language. And according to Mencius, the fact that human beings have this ability means that, unlike animals, they have a lot more control of how they respond to these other kind of motivations they have. Moreover, we're all born, as he views it, with the seeds of goodness. Mencius, in the book called Mencius, describes what he means by this. Mencius said, "Suppose a man were, all of a sudden, to see a young child on the verge of falling into a well. He would certainly be moved by compassion, not because he wanted to get in the good graces of the parents, nor because he wished to win the praise of his fellow villagers or friends, nor yet because he disliked the cry of the child. From this it can be seen that whoever is devoid of the heart of compassion is not human. The heart of compassion is the germ of benevolence, the heart of shame, of dutifulness, the heart of courtesy and modesty, of observance of the rights, the heart of right and wrong, of wisdom. Man has these four germs just as he has four limbs. When these are fully developed, he can take under his protection the whole realm within the four sieves. But if he fails to develop them, he will not even be able to serve his parents." Now, a lot's packed into that story. But what Mencius is proposing, first of all, is let's just imagine a situation where you see a young child about to get into a position of real danger. He thinks it's natural anyone would feel moved to intervene. And although it may well be that this will win commendation or win the admiration of the parents, it may even be that the person doesn't like to hear the screams of a child who is on the verge of falling into a well. Nevertheless, those aren't the important thing. What moves him is really this spirit of compassion. And this is something that is instinctive in us. Mencius talks about these four seeds of goodness, and some of them we've talked about already. For example, Ren is one of them, which we can translate as benevolence. Yi is another one. Ritual propriety, or Li, is another one. And he adds to this list wisdom, or Ji. Now, it might seem kind of odd to say, well, these are already tendencies within us. I mean, certainly we aren't born already knowing rituals, so it would be hard to say that we're fully proper in a ritual sense at birth. And that's not what Mencius is saying. Instead, he's saying that these four virtues actually build from something that's fundamental within us in the first place. That we have natural tendencies that are fulfilled when we develop these full virtues. So it's not reasonable to say, as Mozi does, that people are mainly motivated by fear and desires that are very selfish. Instead, we have other motives stemming from the fact that we have the heart-mind. And as a result of that, these motives make goodness a kind of natural thing. So we have native moral tendencies, you might say. And he does acknowledge that they're germs or seeds. They aren't something that just automatically are going to come to fruition. It's absolutely essential that they be cultivated. So, like Confucius, he thinks cultivation, education, all these things are very important. Learning the code of your society in terms of ritual forms. Learning how to use words in a way that really communicates. All these things are essential for someone to grow up as a mature member of the moral community. But there's already a disposition in us that is directed in the right direction. So one doesn't need to view moral development, as Mozi does, as something that basically has to be controlled by means of external force. People don't have to be forced to be good. One has to cultivate tendencies that they already have from the beginning. In fact, he goes so far as to say that anyone could be a sage, not meaning that anyone at any moment suddenly might turn out to be a sage, but that with proper cultivation, anyone, no matter where they start, can develop sagacity, the ability to really see fully into the world around them. And this, again, depends on these germs. So what society ought to do is make sure to cultivate these things. But by nature, our tendency is working in the right direction. Now, as I mentioned, many people found this a rather optimistic view. At the time that Mencius was teaching, a lot of people were desensitized by the sorts of things that had been happening, just in terms of general unrest and instability. These things continued actually beyond Mencius' time. It was a rather long period of confusion and turbulence in China. And the thinker who represents what's often viewed as a kind of opposing school, Xunzi, who lived a few generations later, was even more in a troubled period. And in fact, he had a real political life himself. He did have a rather high position in a particular court, but the ruler that he was working for got assassinated, and that ended his political career there. So he had some real hands-on experience, you might say, with some of the uglier sides of power conflicts. He didn't worry so much as Confucius did about proper succession. In effect, he just takes dictators to be part of the picture. But nevertheless, he's concerned about good ways to rule and bad ways to rule. So he too views himself as someone who is continuing the Confucian tradition. His focus tends to be rather pragmatic, and this is one of the reasons that he is viewed as realistic. Pragmatic in the sense that he saw a lot of the things that societies had to do to be aimed at really basically fulfilling fundamental needs. He thought societies had to be quite organized if people were even to have enough to eat. It isn't obvious in an agrarian society like China that people are going to have enough to eat. So there has to be some real concentrated effort to make sure that food gets dispersed. He's pragmatic, too, in defending ritual, which might seem a little bit surprising. But he thinks that it's important that ritual play the role that it does in our society. One of the reasons I think it might seem society slightly surprising on the surface is that, in general, ritual would often have to do with things like funerals and so on. And the idea of ancestors and the ancestors' spirits sometimes were a focus of these rituals. It's certainly not that Xunzi was encouraging superstition. He, in fact, was very anti-superstitious. So whenever he was defending ritual, it would be very much in pragmatic terms, what it does for us. And his point was, it's not really that in having a funeral ritual or having an offering to the ancestors that one is talking to another world. But this helps us to channel our emotions. As human beings, we have natural emotions in response to certain upsetting events. And if we have a ritual, this enables us to respond in a way that is controlled and actually made beautiful. He points to tradition, as is typical in Chinese thought, and points out that the rituals were invented by human beings, the sage kings, again, the wisest human beings of the tradition, and they were invented precisely for this reason, to deal with our real situation here and now. Interestingly, he finds music to be one of the kinds of means that is particularly pragmatic in this regard. And here again, he's arguing against the Mohists. The Mohists, because they are concerned with bringing about a certain kind of social order and also with concrete results, tended to downplay the advantages of ritual and music. In fact, they tended to think that far too much was spent on these things, that if rulers wanted to concern themselves with their society, they should be a lot more concerned about everybody getting enough to eat than with having rituals that bring the community together. But Xunzi claims that bringing the community together by means of rituals and music is actually a very fundamental need as well. He comments, "When music is performed in the ancestral temple of the ruler, and the ruler and his ministers, superiors and inferiors, listen to it together, there are none who are not filled with a spirit of harmonious reverence. When it is performed within the household, and father and sons, elder and younger brothers listen to it together, there are none who are not filled with a spirit of harmonious kinship. And when it is performed in the community, and old people and young together listen to it, there are none who are not filled with a spirit of harmonious obedience. What Xunzi is suggesting here is that the harmony of music actually serves to harmonize the community. By listening to music with other people in other positions within society, we're brought to the thought of harmony. You might consider the way different instruments harmonize together, or certainly sometimes a voice and instruments. There's a kind of way that coordination, often of many people, is brought about and turned into something beautiful. Music is a kind of image for this cooperation, where people are freely moving. I mean, you might consider too that dance would often go along with music. People freely move, but nevertheless it's coordinated. And this is a kind of vision of social interaction, of a harmonious kind of relationship. Music also tends to sharpen the senses. It draws attention to itself. We tend to focus on music when we're seriously listening to it in these kind of formal settings. And this, according to Xunzi, served a very vital purpose in society. It allowed people commonly to think about elements of different sorts, whether you're thinking about human beings in different roles in the community, or thinking about the elements of nature, all of these things working together in a kind of harmony. Even our bodily forces are harmonized. The fact that we feel like moving along with music at times would suggest that music is not only reminding us of what it's like to harmonize, to conjoin ourselves cooperatively into some larger kind of event, but also it draws us in. We're aware of our belonging to the larger audience of our community. So Xunzi thinks that it's important to keep in mind that human beings have other needs besides having enough to eat, important as that was, and that it's vital to satisfy emotional, spiritual needs, and to give people a real sense that it's possible to have harmony and really be satisfied at the same time. Of course, Xunzi was well aware that a lot did need to be done socially in order to ensure that people did get enough to eat. His policies in general are not entirely opposed to the Moist policy in that he thinks coercion is necessary too. He thinks both hierarchy and coercion are necessary. The reason he thinks this is he doesn't think that we're going to automatically end up agreeing how to work together unless there's some kind of plan. So he thinks it's important to have a hierarchy. You need some kind of organization so that you can make a plan. Of course, you could have a situation where everybody gets together, agrees something needs to be done, and make a plan collectively, so it would seem. But Xunzi doesn't think that usually works. People start to quarrel. One person has one idea, another person has another idea. This doesn't get anything going. So it's really important to have people who are actually supervising. And inevitably, he thinks, in order to avoid quarreling and actually get some work done, it's going to be necessary to have some people directing other people. Like Confucius, he doesn't see anything inherently wrong with that. But he does think that hierarchy should be based on merit. I'll say more about that in a minute. As far as coercion is concerned, he also thinks there are a lot of situations where people aren't just going to naturally end up doing some of the work that needs to be done. Some work having to do with flooding, for example, really requires getting the whole community out. And people might not automatically end up joining in the effort, or they might have pressing reasons that lead them to do other things. So in fact, he thinks there are times when conscription is appropriate. What's important is if you're going to conscript people to, for example, build dikes, do certain things to prevent flooding, say, that it be at a time that doesn't conflict with parts of the growing season. Again, we assume that most people are farmers, parts of the growing season where they have to be on hand. But it's not unfair to insist that everybody contribute to these efforts. He doesn't think taxation is inherently unfair either, although he thinks there ought to be limits. His limit is 10%. And he is perfectly satisfied to acknowledge that goods are going to be unequally divided. He simply thinks that certain things need to be fair. And one of the things that he urges is that there be minimum standards. At the very least, there ought to be some minimum support that everybody receives. With regard to fairness, he also thinks that it's crucial that the right people be in the right jobs. So he urges meritocracy. Now this fulfills a certain emphasis of Confucius as well. Confucius, after all, thinks a ruler should be a real ruler. Something's wrong if someone isn't fulfilling their title. But he wouldn't go so far as Xunzi. Xunzi thinks that abolishing hereditary titles is the way to go. That one of the reasons why too often there is the wrong person in the job, or a person who isn't really fulfilling their title, is that people just were born into certain positions. So his view was that those kind of inheriting titles should just be abandoned, and that meritocracy should be the basis for putting people in positions of responsibility. The state has a responsibility to look after the least well-off at the same time. So there's a kind of sense of benevolent hierarchy. Those who are in positions to be in charge of other people ought to share in this responsibility. It's not an idea of some people just ordering others around, certainly. But the general vision is that the right people ought to be in the right jobs. In fact, Xunzi, in this connection, emphasizes something which we'll see again in Taoist thought as well. The notion that a ruler who's done a good job of getting the right people in the right jobs doesn't have to do much. Xunzi believes that if a ruler has selected people according to meritocracy, selected people who are right for the job, then there's no need for micromanaging all the time. I mean, that kind of problem comes about because the wrong person is in the job, or because there aren't clear senses of who's going to do certain jobs. Again, this notion of the attunement of names comes back. If people really have a clear idea of what they're responsible for and they're really doing it, then things ought to work pretty smoothly. The way in which Xunzi apparently differs from Mencius most decisively is in his claim that human beings are fundamentally evil or base. The translation usually renders this evil, but I think it's important to understand that what Xunzi means here is not that human beings are inherently sinful. I think in the West, if we have a concept of original sin, we tend to see evil and original sin perhaps as the same sort of thing, especially if you're talking about human nature. What Xunzi is really looking at is what kind of psychological motives we have. And he's saying, well, we've got certain motives, and these are our raw materials. And he's not overly impressed with what they'll do on their own. The main problem is the tendency to selfish desires. He doesn't see anything to be wrong with that. It's just that in themselves, selfish desires are going to conflict. They might conflict in the individual, but they'll certainly conflict among individuals. So conflict is going to be inevitable. And there have to be clear rules for dealing with conflict, at least on the level of desires. He doesn't think desires will automatically organize a society. In this respect, he's countering, in effect, the greed is good philosophy insofar as the idea of greed being good is that just from having basic selfish aims, somehow things will work out so that everybody will end up satisfied. That, according to Xunzi, is not very likely. What he thinks has to be the case is that you have an organization, and for this to happen, we have to cultivate people. Now, this is interesting because, on the one hand, it looks like Xunzi and Mencius couldn't be farther apart. Mencius claiming we have these natural tendencies that need to be cultivated, but nevertheless will bring about a certain desirable moral end. Each person is naturally, instinctively drawn to the sorts of things which are really a virtuous character. Xunzi, on the other hand, thinks, well, no, basically if you look at what we start with a lot of selfish desires, and some kind of external coordination is necessary. But what does he recommend? Actually, the very same thing that Mencius recommends, cultivation. Xunzi's idea is that The fact that human beings can't automatically be expected to organize themselves on the basis of their desires is certainly no reason to despair. This is exactly the point where human beings intervene, where education becomes important. So there's a more apparent difference, I think, between the two thinkers than maybe initially meets the eye. Mencius's vision is that the human being's inner nature is drawn to a certain kind of ideal. In this respect, he resembles, in certain ways, the thinker Aristotle in the West. Aristotle believed that human beings, any being in nature, has its own sense of what's good for it and a natural inclination to pursue that. And of course, he doesn't think that without society, without education, without learning certain sorts of things, that we're going to get to that goal. But he does think built into our nature is this kind of inherent tendency to seek out what's good. Others might disagree with that and think there's more problems to becoming good than simply fulfilling your nature. Certain Christian thinkers, for example, who stress the conflict between the spirit and the flesh, would tend not so much to focus on these tendencies to move toward the good, however you happen to conceive of it, but instead would focus on the fact that there's a conflict inherent in us. You might say that Xunzi is more like these thinkers. It's not that he thinks automatically each of us internally will be conflicted, but he thinks automatically unless some order, unless we use our mind-heart to organize things, just dealing with the kind of level of our basic desires, yes, things will end up in conflict. So again, there's a kind of emphasis in both thinkers on using the mind-heart to cultivate certainly the next generation, but also to cultivate ourselves. And to do this, in effect, what we need are the very things that Confucius claims that we need. We need to focus on the images that come to us from the classics, a sense of who really is exemplary. We need ritual and music. These are particularly helpful, again, much as Confucius says, because they encourage people to cooperate without any kind of aggressive external force pushing them in a certain direction, motivating irritated responses to that, but instead people spontaneously feel like cooperating. That kind of way of enriching and cultivating ourselves strikes both thinkers as completely appropriate. In history, actually, Mencius for a long time was the dominant strain of Confucian thought. The idea that human beings actually were good, fundamentally, appealed to a lot of people after his time. Perhaps this has more to do with the fact that some of Xunzi's students ended up in political positions that ended up sort of undermining his credibility or undermining the desirability of affiliating with him for a while. Later in time, the vision of Xunzi became more dominant. But I think both of these effectively are part of the Confucian tradition as it's received now. And as we look at it, we see that even though the particular things that are focused on are somewhat different, that actually they converge in the really important things. That, yes, we need to coordinate ourselves. Yes, developing virtue is exactly what we ought to concern ourselves with, both in ourselves and in our children, and somehow trying to deal with the way human beings naturally are as part of that picture. The main difference between them is really just what they emphasize. Mencius emphasizes that which in us is naturally tending toward the goal that is really moral maturity. Xunzi emphasizes those things in our nature that tend to obstruct it, but it's really the same vision of moral maturity that they're offering. Thank you.